The worst part wasn't the money. It was the date. 12 years. He had been sending money to her for 12 years. That meant it started when we were still taking vacations together, when we still held hands at church, when I was still making his lunch every morning and tucking a little note inside, because that's what I'd done since the very first year we were married and I didn't know how to stop. 12 years. I found it on a Tuesday in October. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that, because I've had to be clear about it to myself many times since. My husband of 41 years, had passed away in July, and I was finally getting around to going through his desk. The desk I had never touched. The desk he always kept locked, which I thought nothing of, because some people just like their privacy, and I had always respected that. I respected a lot of things as I probably should have questioned. The key was in his sock drawer, small and brass and ordinary, the kind of key that opens everything and tells you nothing. Inside the desk, there were the things you'd expect. Insurance documents, an old watch that had belonged to his father, a folder of receipts going back to 2008 that I couldn't imagine why he'd kept, and then, at the very back, pushed against the wood like he'd wanted it to disappear into the grain, a bank statement, a single printed page, folded in thirds, with an account number I didn't recognize and my husband's name at the top. The balance was just over $4,000. Transfers out every month, regular as breathing. $500, to an account listed only as E. Sumner. I stood there for a long time. I set the paper down on the desk. I walked to the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water, and I stood at the sink and I looked out at the backyard where the oak tree was starting to turn, and I thought, who is E. Sumner? I didn't know anyone named Sumner. I didn't know any woman whose first name started with E and whose last name was Sumner. My husband had worked in insurance for 34 years. He'd had colleagues and clients and the occasional golf buddy, and I knew all of them, or I thought I did. I had cooked dinners for some of them. I had sent their wives Christmas cards. I went back to the desk. I looked at the statement again. The transfers started in January of 2012. January. That was the month we drove to see our daughter and her husband in Vermont, and we got caught in a snowstorm and had to spend the night at a motel outside of Burlington. And my husband laughed and said it was like being young again. I folded the paper back the way I'd found it. I put it in my cardigan pocket. I locked the desk and put the key back in the sock drawer, and I sat down on the edge of the bed and I did not cry. I just sat there. The afternoon light came through the curtains and made a long pale stripe across the floor, and I watched it move the way light does when you have nothing else to look at. That night I made soup from a can and didn't taste it. I am not the kind of woman who goes looking for trouble. I want you to understand that about me before I tell you the rest. I grew up in a household where you did not air your difficulties. You managed. You were sensible. You found a way to keep things running and you didn't make a production of your pain. My mother was that kind of woman and her mother before her, and I suppose I became that kind of woman too, which is sometimes a strength and sometimes it is the very thing that allows you to miss what's right in front of you. But I am also 67 years old, and I have lived long enough to know that when something feels wrong, it is wrong. You can explain it away for a while. You can decide the explanation is innocent. But the feeling doesn't go away. It just waits. The feeling had been waiting for years. I just hadn't known what it was waiting for. I called my son 3 days later. I called him because he and his father had been close in a way that my daughter and my husband never quite managed. My son had worked summers at his father's office during college. They watched football together. When my husband got his diagnosis 2 years ago, the heart condition that eventually took him, it was my son who flew home first, who sat with him in the hospital, who handled the paperwork because I was too shaky to hold a pen. I trusted my son. I said I needed to talk to him about some financial things I'd found in your father's desk. I kept my voice neutral. I have always been good at keeping my voice neutral, he said. Sure, Mom. Of course. I said I found a bank statement for an account I didn't know about. He went quiet. It was a very specific kind of quiet. Not confused. Not the quiet of someone trying to remember or process. It was the quiet of someone who has been expecting a phone call and has finally received it. I said, do you know who E. Sumner is? He said, Mom. I said, do you know who she is? It wasn't a question anymore. He said, how much do you know? And that was when the floor shifted. Because that is not a question you ask someone who has stumbled onto something innocent. That is the question of a person calculating what they can still keep from you. I said, I know about the account. I know he was sending $500 a month for 12 years. I know her name starts with E and her last name is Sumner, and I have never heard of her in my life. I said all of this very calmly. I was sitting at the kitchen table with my hands flat on the wood and I focused on the grain of it. He was quiet again. Then he said, "Her name is Elaine." I waited. He said, "She and Dad, they were together. Before you, and then again later." He said it was complicated. He said Dad had told him about it 6 years ago and made him promise not to say anything. He said he didn't know what to do. He said he'd told himself it wasn't his place. I said, "When did he tell you?" He said 6 years ago, when I flew back for that weekend. "You remember, Mom?" I said it was a work thing. I remembered. I had made his favorite meal when he arrived, pot roast. I had been so happy to see him. I said, "She has a child." He didn't say anything. I said, "She has a child with your father, don't she?" And he said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I hung up the phone. I sat there for a very long time. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car went past. I thought about the pot roast. I thought about the note I'd put in my husband's lunch the morning of the day. I'm now certain he first called her. I had written something small and fond on it. I can't remember exactly what. Something about how I was glad we had each other. I used to write things like that. I used to think it mattered. She had a boy. He was 10 years old. My husband had been his father for 10 years, and I did not know this child existed. I found this out not from my son but from my daughter, who I called the following afternoon after a night of very little sleep. My daughter was harder to reach. She is a practical woman, my daughter, careful with her words, careful with her feelings. When she answered and I told her what I'd found, there was no quiet. There was just a long breath, like she'd been holding it for some time. She said, "How did you find out?" Not, "What are you talking about?" Not, "That doesn't make sense." Just, "How?" I said, "The bank statement." She said, "I only found out 8 months ago." I want you to know that, Mom. I only found out 8 months ago when your son told me. I was going to tell you. I didn't know how. 8 months. She'd been sitting across from me at Easter and Thanksgiving and the Sunday dinners we'd had after her father's funeral, and she had known. I said, "Does her son know about us?" She said she didn't think so. She said the woman, Elaine, had apparently kept the two lives separate. She said Dad had set up the account so there would be no trail on the joint finances. She said he had been very careful. I said yes, he was. I said I needed to go, and I hung up, and I walked out the back door and stood in the yard's icy slippers and just breathed the cold air until I felt something close to steady. The oak tree dropped a leaf. Then another one. I watched them fall. I want to tell you something about grief, about the kind I had been carrying since July. When my husband died, I grieved him the way you grieve someone you have built a life with. 41 years. I grieved the weight of him in the bed. I grieved his particular way of reading the newspaper, folded into quarters, which drove me to distraction for decades and which I would have given anything to see again. I grieved his voice. I grieved the way he took his coffee. I grieved all of it. And then I found the bank statement, and the grief did not stop, but it became something different, something with edges, something that cut. Because I was still grieving him. That was the terrible thing. I was angry, and I was grieving him at the same time, and there is nothing lonelier than grieving a person you are also furious at, because you cannot reach them. You cannot say, "How could you?" You cannot hear them explain. You cannot even have the argument. He was gone, and he had taken all of his answers with him and left me here holding the questions. I thought about her, Elaine. I thought about what she was doing in October, whether she was grieving too, whether she knew he was gone, whether someone had told her, or whether she had simply noticed in July that the transfers stopped. I did not feel hate for her. I want to be honest about that because it surprised me. I thought I would feel hate and I didn't. I felt something more like exhaustion, like, of course. Of course there was an Elaine. Of course there was a 10-year-old boy with my husband's eyes somewhere in the world, and I was the last to know. I contacted a lawyer. My neighbor had used a woman downtown, an estate attorney, and she came highly recommended. I made an appointment, and I drove myself there on a Wednesday morning in November, past the coffee shop where my husband and I used to go on weekends, past the hardware store where he'd bought the shelves he built in the garage, past all of the ordinary geography of a shared life. The attorney was younger than I expected, calm and precise. I laid out what I knew, and she listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. She said the secret account was in his name alone, which meant it was part of his estate. She said that as his spouse I had legal rights that superseded what he may or may not have wished to do with those funds. She said that the existence of another child complicated things but did not undo what I was entitled to. She said, "Were you aware of any changes to his will?" I said no. I said we'd made our wills together years ago, and as far as I knew they'd never been changed. She said, "Let's find out." It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks during which I went to the grocery store and raked leaves, and called my sisters in Phoenix, and did not tell her any of this because I didn't know how to begin. 2 weeks during which I watched television I didn't absorb and slept badly, and woke at 3 in the morning with a feeling in my chest like something unfinished. His will had not been changed. Everything came to me the way it was always supposed to. The secret account, the transfers, the remaining balance, all of it folded into the estate. All of it, eventually, mine. I don't say that with triumph. I say it with something more complicated. Because the money was never really the point. The money was just the paper trails of something that mattered far more. In December, I wrote my son a letter, not an email. A letter on the good stationery I keep in the drawer in the secretary desk in the living room. I told him that I loved him. I told him that I understood he had been put in an impossible position, that his father had no right to ask that of him, and that I did not blame him for not knowing what to do. I told him that the wound was real, but that I did not intend to let it end what we were to each other. I mailed it on a Thursday. He called me that Sunday and we talked for an hour, and some of what we said was hard, and some of it was easier than I expected, and when we hung up I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not better, exactly, but like something had started to move again. I called my daughter the following week. That conversation was shorter, more careful. We are still finding our way back to each other, she and I. We always have been, if I'm being honest. She is not an easy woman to know. She gets that from her father's side. But I called her and she answered, and that was something. I found out about the boy in a way I hadn't expected. I wasn't looking. I want to be clear about that too. I was going through my husband's email, the account I'd known about, the one where he'd saved digital receipts, looking for a warranty for the water heater, which had started making a noise. And I found a thread, buried under years of ordinary correspondence, from an address I didn't recognize. The name in the address was a set of initials, E.S. Sumner. I almost closed it. I held the cursor there for a long moment. Then I opened it. There were photographs. The most recent one was from 3 years ago. A boy, dark-haired, maybe 7 in the picture, standing in front of a birthday cake, grinning the enormous grin of a child who knows everyone is looking at him and loves it. He was wearing a striped shirt. He looked happy in the uncomplicated way only children can manage. And he had my husband's nose. My husband's particular nose, which I had looked at across the breakfast table for 41 years. There was no question. I closed the laptop. I went to the window and looked out at the street. A woman was walking a dog. A boy was riding a bike too fast, the way boys do. Ordinary Tuesday. The world entirely uninterested in what I had just seen. I thought, that child did not ask for any of this. That child is 10 years old and he lost his father in July, and he doesn't know he has a brother and a sister and a grandmother who makes pot roast and keeps the good stationery in the secretary desk. I sat with that for a long time. I don't know what I will do with it. I don't know if there is anything to do. Some things you carry forward and some things you lay down, and I haven't decided yet which this is. It is March now. The oak tree in the backyard is coming back. Those first small, tight buds that you only notice if you're looking. I'm outside more than I used to be. I bought new garden gloves in February, the good kind, the ones that actually fit. And I've been out there in the mornings when the light is still low and the air smells like wet soil, just working. There is something useful about putting your hands in the ground. Something that doesn't ask anything of you except attention. I've been talking to a woman at my church, not a therapist. I know some people think I should see a therapist, and maybe they're right. But for now it's this woman, a widow herself, who lost her husband some years ago under circumstances she describes as complicated, and who has a particular quality of listening that I find rare and valuable. We meet for coffee on Thursdays. She doesn't offer advice unless I ask for it. I asked for it once, and what she said was, the story you tell yourself about your life doesn't have to include everything that happened to you. You get to decide what the story is about. I've been thinking about that. The story I'm deciding on is this. I was married to a man who was capable of more deception than I knew. That is true. I was not always given what I deserved. That is also true. My children failed me in a moment when they should have been braver. That is true as well. And I am 67 years old and I got up every morning this winter, and I made my coffee and I did what needed doing. I called the lawyer and I wrote the letter and I went to the grocery store and I raked the leaves, and I cried when I needed to and stopped when I could. I am still here. I kept the house. I kept myself. The first time I made pot roast again, this was February, a Sunday, just for myself. I sat down at the table and I looked at the empty chair across from me, and I felt all of it. The love and the anger and the grief and the betrayal and the 20 things that don't have names. I felt all of it, and I ate the whole meal, and I washed the dishes and I put on the kettle for tea. Some nights I still wake at 3 in the morning. Some nights the weight of it settles back on my chest, and I have to remind myself to breathe slowly. But the mornings come. They keep coming. The light through the curtains and the sound of birds, and the smell of coffee, and the whole long, ordinary day ahead. I am still learning what it means to live as someone who knows what I now know. I suspect that will take a while. I'm not in a hurry. The oak tree is budding. My garden gloves are hanging by the back door. The kettle is on. I kept going. That is the story I'm telling.